Nadine Carver was 37 years old the day her husband handed her a signed divorce decree, a box of her own clothes, and the name of a shelter 2 miles from the home she had spent 8 years helping him build. She had no car by then. He had taken the joint account down to $11 2 weeks before filing, a number she had discovered standing at a pharmacy counter trying to buy cough medicine on a Tuesday evening in November. She had paid in change. He had watched her do it once months earlier and said nothing, which told her now that he had already been watching the account the way a man watches a clock he has set himself. She slept on her cousin Vera's pull-out sofa for 6 weeks after the divorce was finalized, in a living room that smelled of cedar and old carpet, and she had been grateful for every night of it. What Warren Price did not know, what he had never once thought to ask in 8 years of marriage, was why a woman with a civil engineering degree, a contractor's license, and a grandmother who had quietly built and held property in Nashville for 40 years had chosen to keep a second set of accounts that he had no access to and no knowledge of. He had assumed the answer was that there was nothing in them worth knowing about. 3 years later, he stood on the front steps of a house that backed up to the Cumberland River and knocked on a door he did not recognize, with tears on his face and a story he believed she would want to hear. He had no idea what was waiting for him on the other side of that door. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The apartment on Fern Avenue had one window that faced east, and on good mornings the light came in at an angle that made the whole room feel larger than its square footage. Nadine had lived there for 3 years before she married Warren, and in that time she had replastered the wall beside the radiator, refinished the floors herself over a long weekend with a rented drum sander and 4 hours of online research, and built the bookshelf that ran the full length of the north wall from reclaimed oak she had sourced from a salvage yard on the south side of town. The landlord had offered to knock $200 off a month's rent in exchange. She had declined. She had built the shelf because she wanted it built, and she had always understood that the value of a thing you built yourself was not the thing. It was the knowledge that you could. Her grandmother, Ida Carver, had said it differently and more plainly. Ida had come up from Alabama in 1961 with $40 and a sewing machine, and had by 1979 owned 3 rental properties in the Germantown neighborhood of Nashville, all of them purchased quietly. None of them announced. She used to say, "The ones who don't see you coming can't prepare for your arrival." She said it so often that it had stopped sounding like wisdom and started sounding like weather, something permanent and reliably true. Nadine had been a civil engineer for 9 years before she met Warren Price. She had spent those years designing drainage systems and load-bearing structures and foundation plans for commercial developments across Middle Tennessee. Work that required an almost architectural patience, the understanding that the most important parts of any structure were the ones no one ever looked at directly. She was methodical by training and by temperament. She did not rush conclusions. She did not perform certainty she hadn't earned. She had met Warren at a professional mixer in Midtown, a networking event she had attended mostly because her colleague had begged her to, and had then canceled at the last hour. Warren sold industrial equipment and was good at the particular warmth that salesmen cultivate, attentive, curious, easy to be around in the way of men who have learned that listening is its own kind of leverage. He was handsome in a straightforward way. He asked good questions. He remembered, 2 weeks after they first met, that she had mentioned liking a specific kind of tea, and he brought a box of it on their second date without making a production of it. She had liked him before she had any reason not to. They married after 2 years of dating in the backyard of her aunt's house in Bordeaux in September, on a day that was warm and still and smelled of late roses from the garden her aunt had kept for 30 years. She had designed the arbor herself, a clean rectangular frame in white-painted cedar. Nothing fussy, nothing that would compete with the yard's existing trees. and built it with 2 cousins over a long Saturday in August. It was the most beautiful thing she had built for anyone other than herself. It was still standing when she left. The first sign had come 18 months into the marriage, when she found a receipt in a jacket pocket for a dinner at a restaurant she had not been to, on a night he had told her he was catching up on paperwork at the office. She had looked at it for a long moment, then folded it carefully and placed it in the small fireproof box she kept in the back of the bedroom closet, behind the extra blankets, where she had always kept documents she thought might matter later. It was a habit her grandmother had given her. Never throw away something you might need to prove. She had not confronted him that night. She had made dinner. She had asked about the office. She had listened. She had documented instead. Her grandmother Ida had grown up in a time when a woman's legal claim to her own life was narrow and contested, and she had responded to that fact not with bitterness, but with a meticulous, lifelong discipline of building what could not be easily taken. She owned 3 houses outright by the time she was 60, and she had done it by moving quietly and keeping records and never confusing what a man said with what a situation actually was. She used to tell Nadine, "A woman who trusts her own documentation never has to beg anyone to believe her." Nadine had taken that in at 9 years old and had never let it go. Freedom, Ida had also said once, starts with what you refuse to give away. Nadine had refused to give away a great deal, and she had done it so quietly that the man who lived beside her had never noticed the shape of what he was missing. Nadine found the second receipt 4 months later, in March, tucked inside the passenger sun visor of his truck, a truck she had helped pay for. On a morning she had borrowed it to haul materials from the salvage yard. This one was a hotel receipt. 1 night. 1 room. He had not been at a conference that weekend. She had believed he was because he had told her he was, and she had been in the middle of a foundation inspection for a project in Smyrna and had not thought to question it. She sat in the driver's seat of his truck in the salvage yard parking lot and looked at the receipt for a long time. The morning was cold and the truck's engine ticked as it settled, and a thin line of cloud moved across the sky above the yard's chain-link fence. Her face remained perfectly calm. She was a civil engineer. The first principle of structural assessment was that you did not move anything until you understood what it was holding up. You did not pull a beam to see what happened. You measured, you documented, you mapped the load paths, and then you made a decision with complete information. She had always applied this to everything she built. She was applying it now. She photographed the receipt with her personal phone, in focus from 2 angles. She placed it back exactly as she had found it, at the same depth in the visor, facing the same direction. She drove to the salvage yard, loaded the cedar planks she had come for, drove home, and unloaded them in the garage without asking for help. She did not say anything at dinner that evening. She asked about his week and listened to his answer and passed the bread without being asked. And she watched his face across the table with the attention of a woman who had just confirmed that the man in front of her had been constructing something she was not supposed to see. Over the following 3 weeks, she moved quietly through the architecture of their shared finances the way she moved through any site plan, systematically, without skipping levels, looking for the structural truth beneath the surface presentation. What she found was not surprising in its nature, only in its scope. He had been drawing down their joint savings account in increments for at least 14 months. Amounts small enough individually to escape notice, consistent enough in aggregate to constitute a plan. $41,200 transferred in pieces, moved out of their shared accounts and into an account she had no access to and had not known existed. He had been building his exit while she was building their life. She made no outward change. She continued to go to work. She cooked on Wednesdays and Sundays the way she always had, the same rotation of meals. the same playlist on the kitchen speaker, the same habit of asking if he wanted more before she put the pot away. She laughed at his jokes. She drove him to the airport when he had a trade show in Houston and waved from the curb. She gave him no indication that anything had shifted, because nothing had shifted in the way he would have recognized. The anger and the grief were both real and both present, but they were operating below the surface the way the most important structural elements of any building operated below the surface, doing the load-bearing work invisibly while everything above it looked fine. She was a civil engineer. She understood load-bearing work. She opened a separate encrypted folder on her personal hard drive. She labeled it simply, Project Foundation. Over the following 8 days, she assembled what she needed. She pulled every joint bank statement going back 2 years and organized them by month and by transaction type. She cross-referenced dates. She built a spreadsheet, neat, sourced, annotated, that mapped every withdrawal of more than $300 against Warren's calendar for the corresponding week. The pattern that emerged was not ambiguous. It was the kind of evidence that in a structural context would have required immediate remediation. 14 months. $41,200. Deliberate. Incremental. Executed by a man who had spent those 14 months sleeping in the same bed as the woman he was quietly robbing. She printed the spreadsheet. She printed the bank statements. She put everything in a manila folder and labeled it in her own handwriting. She made a single phone call on a Thursday afternoon from her car in the parking deck at work to a woman she had known for 11 years. She said, "Lorraine, I need to come see you, and bring your whole afternoon." Lorraine Dupre had practiced family law in Nashville for 26 years. She was 59, compact and direct, with a reputation in Davidson County legal circles for the particular quality of not being surprised by anything men did when they believed they had already won. She had a framed print on the wall of her office that said nothing decorative. It was a quote from a Tennessee Supreme Court ruling about equitable distribution, and she had put it there because clients needed to understand, before they sat down, that the conversation they were about to have was grounded in law and not in feelings. She reviewed the contents of Nadine's folder, the receipts, the annotated bank records, the transfer history mapped against the calendar, the documentation Nadine had assembled with the systematic precision of someone whose profession required her to build things that held, and was quiet for a full minute after she finished. Then she said, "He's been doing this for over a year." Nadine said, "At least 14 months based on what I can verify from statements I have access to. Possibly longer." Lorraine said, "That establishes a pattern of dissipation. That's significant under Tennessee statute." She made 3 notes on her legal pad. "You have certified copies of the transfers? Time-stamped account statements and a certified bank printout I requested last week." "Good." Lorraine set down her pen. "What I need you to understand before we go further is that Tennessee is an equitable distribution state, which means the court looks at what was marital and what was separate, and what was done with each. What he moved, we argue for recovery. What he hid, we find. The question that shapes everything else is, how much of what you were building before you married him still belongs categorically to you?" Nadine looked at her evenly across the desk. She said, "More than he knows, more than he ever thought to ask about." That was the beginning of the conversation that took 3 more sessions to complete. The full accounting of what Nadine Carver had built and held before Warren Price had ever been a factor in her life. She presented it the way she presented everything. In order, sourced, without drama. The individual investment account she had maintained since she was 24, funded over 9 years from every project bonus and every freelance structural consulting contract she had taken on outside her salaried position. the 2 parcels of undeveloped land in Cheatham County that she had purchased, in her name alone and with her own funds during the 2nd year of the marriage, using money that had come directly from an inheritance her grandmother had structured carefully to ensure it passed without complication. And the LLC she had registered 18 months before the wedding, a construction and engineering consulting firm that had been operating quietly, with paying clients, for nearly 4 years, generating revenue that she had managed entirely in her own accounts, separate from anything Warren touched or knew the details of. Warren had known about the LLC in the broadest possible terms. He had called it her little side thing when it came up, which was rarely, and she had neither corrected him nor elaborated, because she had understood from the beginning, in the way of a woman raised by Ida Carver, that the ones who underestimated you were extending a courtesy you should accept graciously and never explain away. Lorraine looked at the complete picture spread across her conference table and said, with the measured satisfaction of a woman who had seen many cases and recognized the rare ones, "He has no idea what he is divorcing." Nadine said, "No, he does not. Real power," she thought on the drive home, operated quietly and built in the dark, and waited for the right moment. 2 weeks later, Warren presented her with divorce papers at the kitchen table in the house on Westover Hills Boulevard. In the manner of a man extending a formality he expected to be received without argument. He had retained an attorney. He was seeking the house, the full balance of the joint savings account, and a settlement for Nadine that reflected the assumption that she had nothing else. No independent assets, no separate holdings, no resources he had failed to account for, because he had never genuinely looked at what she was. He had seen what was convenient to see and had built his entire exit strategy on the assumption that what was convenient was also complete. She looked at the papers for a moment. She said, quietly, that she would need to consult her attorney before signing anything. He looked at her with a brief, fractional surprise, the kind that crosses a face before it can be managed, and then recovered. He said that was fine. He said it the way people say things are fine when they are certain fine is what will happen regardless. She went to Vera's that evening. She slept on the pull-out sofa. She slept better than she had in 6 months. Preparation, she thought, was the work. And the work was already done. What unfolded in the subsequent 6 weeks in Davidson County Family Court was not. To anyone watching from the outside, a dramatic event. It looked like paperwork. It was paperwork. It was also, underneath the paperwork, the systematic dismantling of a man's assumptions about what he had married and what he was owed. Lorraine filed a counterpetition that included a full disclosure of the marital estate as Nadine had documented it, including the $41,200 that Warren had transferred out of the joint account, in a pattern consistent with premeditated dissipation of marital assets, a legal term that, in Tennessee, carried specific and unfavorable consequences for the party who had done the dissipating. The filing also included documentation of the hotel receipt and the restaurant receipts, which established both the duration of the extramarital relationship and the timeline of when Warren had begun drawing down their finances. His attorney asked for a continuance. Lorraine said no. The woman Warren had been seeing was named Greta, and she had been under the impression, according to a source that Nadine did not pursue further, that Warren was substantially wealthier than he was. That impression had been built on the assumption that the house, the joint accounts, and the general infrastructure of his comfortable life were things he had built. When it became apparent during the proceedings that the civil engineering consulting contracts that had funded much of their household renovation, the land in Cheatham County, the LLC with 18 months of documented revenue, when all of that surfaced as belonging entirely to Nadine, independent of their marriage, certain assumptions appear to have been revised. Greta was not a factor in Nadine's final accounting. She was simply a detail, like a misread elevation line in a site plan. You noted it, you corrected for it, and you moved on. The settlement took 11 days to negotiate. Warren retained his personal accounts and his truck, both of which were in his name alone. The house on Westover Hills Boulevard, which carried a mortgage on which Nadine's income had been the primary qualifying factor, was sold, and the proceeds after settlement of the joint debt were divided according to a calculation that accounted for the dissipated assets and resolved in Nadine's favor by a number that she was satisfied with and that she did not discuss with people who had not asked. She stood on the steps of the courthouse on a cold Tuesday afternoon in November and shook Lorraine's hand and thanked her. Lorraine said, "Go build something." She said, "I already have been." 3 years passed the way years pass when a person is doing the work they were built to do. The house that backed up to the Cumberland River had taken Nadine 14 months to design and 9 months to build. Working with a crew she had assembled from contractors she had trusted for years, overseeing every phase with the same attention she brought to the commercial projects that had, over 3 years, turned her consulting firm from a side arrangement into the primary vehicle of everything she did professionally. The firm now held contracts with 4 development companies operating across Middle Tennessee and 2 in northern Alabama. She had hired 3 engineers. She had taken on a junior partner, a woman named Claire, who had the same methodical quality Nadine recognized from the inside out. The revenue in the firm's most recent fiscal year had exceeded $900,000, a number she kept in a spreadsheet and reviewed without ceremony, because it was simply the result of what happened when you built carefully and did not stop. The house itself was everything the apartment on Fern Avenue had been in potential and had not had the room to become. Wide ceilings, south-facing glass that poured morning light into every main room, a kitchen with a soapstone island she had cut and set herself in a single long Saturday, the kind of project that required patience and the willingness to work on your knees for hours. A deck off the back that stepped down to the riverbank in 3 stages, each level planked in cedar that she had chosen board by board at the yard. She had planted a magnolia at the eastern corner of the property the week the crew finished framing, and in 3 years it had grown to the point where, on certain mornings, it blocked the angle of the sunrise just enough to make the light come through soft, rather than direct, which was the specific quality she had been waiting for when she chose the spot. She had not been lonely, exactly. She had been full of other things, and fullness leaves little room for the particular ache of absence. There was a man named Gerald, a musician who taught at the university and who had the particular quality of genuineness that she recognized as rare and did not take for granted. He was not the center of her story. He was present in it, which was enough, and which was, she had come to understand, what presence in a life was actually for. It was a Saturday in October, late in the afternoon when the knock came. She heard it from the kitchen, where she was reviewing a bid proposal, and she was not expecting anyone. She set the proposal down and went to the front door. Warren was standing on the top step with his hands at his sides and something on his face that she had not seen there in 8 years of knowing him. He had aged in the way of men who had made a series of choices that did not agree with them, not dramatically, but around the edges, where effort usually settled. His jacket was not the jacket of a man who was doing well. He looked at her the way people look when they have rehearsed what they are about to say and have already lost confidence in it. He said, "Nadine." His voice was unsteady. "I didn't know. I didn't know this was your house." She looked at him for a moment. She said, "You were looking for something?" He told her, with the fragmented honesty of a man who had run out of the other kind, that Greta had left, that the position he had taken in Memphis had not lasted past the first year, that he had been trying to rebuild a client base and had not been able to. and that a friend had told him about a Nashville consulting firm that was doing the kind of development work he was hoping to pitch a new equipment line toward, and he had driven 3 hours to knock on a door he had not known was hers. His eyes were wet by the end of it. She waited until he was finished. She said, "I'm not the person who can help you with that." She said it the way she said everything, without elevation, without drama, without anger, because the anger had done its useful work 3 years ago and had long since been released. She was not interested in his ruin. She had never been. She was interested only in what she was building and in who she had chosen to build it with, and Warren Price was not part of either of those things. She wished him well. She said it, and meant it in the way that you mean something you have thought about honestly and arrived at through clear understanding rather than feeling. She closed the door. She stood in the entryway of the house she had designed and built from the foundation up, in the light that came through the south-facing glass. And she was quiet for a moment. Then she went back to the kitchen and picked up the bid proposal and continued reading from the line where she had left off. She had built everything worth keeping. She was only getting started. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.